There is a particular kind of pride that lives in a man who has spent his whole life doing things alone. You can see it in the way he walks, steady, unhurried, like the land itself taught him how to move. You can hear it in the pauses between his words, those long silences that say more than most men manage in a full hour of talking. I was that kind of man. I had been that kind of man for nearly 50 years, and I had made my peace with it, or so I believed. The horse came to me in the spring of 1883, with the mud still clinging to the creek banks and the cottonwoods just beginning to leaf out along the fence line. She was a black mare, cold dark from nose to tail, with a white blaze across her face shaped something like a river on an old map. A man passing through Caldwell County had sold her to me for less than she was worth, and I should have asked myself why that morning instead of years later. I called her Raven. She was the most beautiful animal I had ever owned. She was also completely, stubbornly, dangerously untamable. 3 months I worked with that mare. 3 months of early mornings in the round pen, patient hands, soft words, all the things my father's father had taught me about horses when I was a boy no taller than a fence post. I had gentled horses before. I had taken animals half-wild from the open range and turned them into partners a man could trust his life to. Raven was not those horses. She threw me twice. Broke 2 of my fence rails, bit through a good leather halter like it was made of paper. Every man in town who saw her said the same thing: put her down or sell her on. She's too far gone. Some creatures just can't be reached. I didn't believe that. I never have believed that about anything alive. But by the time July came rolling in hot and dry across the Kansas prairie, I had to admit to myself, in the quiet honesty a man only manages when nobody is watching, that I needed help. And the only person within 20 miles who I thought might have the answer lived in the old Hatcher place, just over the ridge, my neighbor. A woman I had spoken fewer than 30 words to in the year and a half she had been there. I didn't know, riding over that ridge, that asking for her help would cost me something I had been carrying for 11 years. I didn't know it would also give me something I hadn't dared name in just as long. My name is Callum Bryce. I ran a cattle operation on about 400 acres outside the town of Millhaven, Kansas, which wasn't much of a town but was enough of one to have a church, a general store, a saloon that stayed busy on Fridays, and roughly 200 people who felt entitled to know your business and comment on it freely. I had been a widower since the winter of 1872. My wife, Eleanor, had died of a fever the December before our son turned 3 years old. We had been married 6 years. In that time she had made our house into something that deserved to be called a home: curtains she had sewn herself, a kitchen garden she tended like it was sacred ground. The smell of bread baking on Sunday mornings that I still sometimes think I catch on the wind when the weather is just right. When she died, the house stayed standing, the ranch kept going. I kept going because my boy needed me to, and then because it was all I knew how to do. My son Thomas was 14 that summer. He was a good boy, quiet and steady like his mother, with none of my stubbornness and all of her patience. He helped me with the cattle, kept up with his schoolwork, and had already decided, with the calm certainty of a boy who knows his own mind, that he wanted to study medicine one day. I didn't argue with him. Eleanor had wanted him to have choices I never had, and I intended to honor that. Thomas was the one who first noticed the Hatcher place had been occupied again. The old Hatcher house had sat empty for nearly 4 years after Burl Hatcher drank himself through his savings and eventually through his will to live. The land was decent, good creek access, a sound barn, about 160 acres of pasture and timber. I had considered buying it myself, but the bank in Millhaven had moved faster than I expected, and the property had sold to someone out of Missouri before I ever got the paperwork sorted. "There's a woman living over at the Hatcher place," Thomas had told me one evening in early spring of 1882. He'd said it the way a 14-year-old says things, casual on the surface, but watching me sideways to see what I'd do with the information. "Is that right?" I said, not looking up from my supper. She's got a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, saw them at the general store. She bought a good deal of fencing wire. I had looked up at that. A woman alone buying fencing wire usually meant she intended to do the fencing herself. That said something. Mind your business, Thomas, I had said, but not unkindly. Over the following year, I had seen her perhaps 4 or 5 times. Her name was Clara Aldridge. She was a widow herself, though I learned that from the town gossip rather than from anything she ever said to me. Her husband had died somewhere back in Missouri 2 years before she came to Kansas, and she had come west with her daughter Lily. And apparently with more determination than most men twice her size. She was not a young woman in the way that Millhaven sometimes talked about young women, soft-spoken and waiting to be settled. She was perhaps 40, close to my own age, with dark hair that carried a few threads of silver and the kind of face that had learned the difference between a hard life and a broken one. And had chosen neither. She ran her small operation herself. Chickens, a kitchen garden that made Alieners look modest, a milk cow, and a few horses she seemed to know considerably more about than I gave her credit for. That last part is what brought me to her door in the first week of July, 1883. I rode Raven's pasture mate, an old reliable roan named Chester, up the Ridge Road and down toward the Hatcher, toward the Aldridge place just after 7 in the morning. The air already had that flat, hot smell that meant a Kansas summer was fully committed to making its point. Clara Aldridge was at the fence when I arrived, stretching wire with a pair of gloves and a focus that said she didn't need interrupting. Her daughter Lily was sitting on the top rail watching her, small legs swinging. I pulled Chester to a stop and took my hat off. "Mrs. Aldridge," I said. She looked up without surprise, like she'd already heard me coming. "Mr. Bryce." There was a pause, the kind that in this part of the country can mean anything from hostility to simple patience. "I've got a horse problem," I said. She looked at me for a moment, then she looked at Chester as if assessing whether the problem was standing in front of her. "Not this one," I said, "a black mare. I've been trying to gentle her since April and I'm not making progress." She pulled off one glove and hooked it over the fence wire. "What have you tried?" I told her, "all of it. The round pen work, the join-up method my grandfather had used, the slow approach, the patience, the consistency." She listened without interrupting, which was more than most people in Millhaven would have done. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Lily was watching me with the frank and uncomplicated curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to disguise her interest. "I've seen that horse," Clara said finally. "Watched her from the ridge a few times. She's not mean." "No," I agreed. "She's afraid." Something shifted in her expression so briefly I might have imagined it. "There's a difference," she said. "I know." Another silence. The wind moved through the cottonwoods along the fence line. "I'll come have a look," she said. "Thursday, if that suits." I put my hat back on. "Thursday suits fine." I rode back over the ridge thinking I had simply arranged for a neighbor with a good eye for horses to offer me an opinion. I was 50 years old and not prone to foolishness. I was also, I would learn, more wrong than I had been about anything since I was young enough to afford it. Clara Aldridge arrived on Thursday morning with Lily beside her on a small gray pony and an unhurried manner that I recognized. Because it was the same quality I valued most in people who were good with animals. She didn't announce anything, she didn't offer opinions before she had information. She simply tied her horse at the post, walked to the round pen where Raven stood watching from the far side and put her forearms on the top rail and looked. She looked for a long time. Raven watched back. The mare's ears were high, her body still in the way that isn't calm but is coiled, every muscle ready to argue. "She was hurt before," Clara said, not a question. "I believe so, not by a person I'd guess. Something scared her when she was still learning what to trust." I had come to the same conclusion. "That's what I think." She was quiet another moment. Then she said, "May I go in?" I opened the gate without hesitation. I am not sure why I did exactly. I had seen plenty of confident people walk into that pen and come out shaken and embarrassed. Something told me Clara Aldridge would not be among them. She walked in slowly, not directly at the mare, but at an angle like she was interested in the fence post on the far side, and Raven was simply a coincidence in her path. She had her hands loose at her sides, her shoulders were down, she moved like water moving, no edges, no urgency. Raven shifted, stamped once, moved away along the rail. Clara let her go. Followed at that same unhurried angle, never straight on, never pushing. I stood at the gate and watched, and Lily stood beside me and watched too, and neither of us said a word. It took 40 minutes. At the end of 40 minutes, Raven was standing still while Clara's hand moved slowly up the mare's neck, and the mare's ears had dropped, not flat, not afraid, but soft. Listening, Lily leaned against the fence beside me. "Mama does that," she said quietly. "Does what?" I asked. "Makes things feel like she's not trying." I looked down at the girl. She was watching her mother with an expression that was simply love, the kind children wear openly that grown people spend years learning to hide. "She's remarkable," I said. Lily nodded like I'd said something obvious. After that Thursday, Clara came back the following Tuesday, and then again the Thursday after that. There was no formal arrangement. She simply came when she could, and I was always there when she arrived, which after the second visit I had to admit to myself was not an accident. Thomas noticed. He was 14 years old, which is old enough to notice everything and young enough to say it out loud. "She stays for coffee," he said one evening. "She does," I said. "And you talk?" "We do." He was quiet for a moment in the way he was when he was deciding whether the next words were worth the trouble. "You talk more than you usually talk," he said finally. I didn't answer that, but I also didn't deny it, which in our house amounted to the same thing. The coffee had started the second week when Clara arrived in a light drizzle, and I had a pot already on the stove. It would have been rude not to offer. She had accepted with a naturalness that said she wasn't reading anything into it, and we had sat on the porch in the rain while Lily played with the barn cat and we talked about horses. And then about cattle, and then, gradually, over several visits, about other things. She had grown up in Tennessee. Had married at 22 to a man named George Aldridge, who was a good man, she said, and she said it with the kind of simple honesty that told me she meant it without embellishment. He had died of a bad heart, unexpected, in the winter of 1879. She had held on in Missouri for 2 years before deciding that holding on wasn't the same as moving forward. "What made you choose Kansas?" I asked her once. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked out at the prairie. "The sky," she said, "it's bigger here." I needed to be somewhere the sky was bigger than what I was carrying. I understood that better than I could say. I told her about a leaner. Not all at once, not in a rush, but in the pieces that came naturally when someone is patient enough to receive them without turning them into something they need to respond to. She listened the same way she worked with Raven, quietly, with her whole attention, without trying to fix anything. By the middle of August, Raven was accepting a saddle blanket. By the end of August, Clara had put a saddle on her for the first time, and the mare had stood for it, still nervous, still watchful, but standing. "You've done more in 6 weeks than I did in 3 months, I told her. She shook her head. "You laid the foundation, I just came in at the right moment." It was a generous thing to say. I was not sure it was entirely true, but I kept that to myself. What I could not keep entirely to myself, what I was beginning to have serious difficulty containing, was the fact that somewhere in those 6 weeks I had stopped thinking about Clara Aldridge as my neighbor with a gift for horses and started thinking about her in ways that made me feel young and foolish and alive all at the same time. Which, at 50 years old and 11 years widowed, was a disorienting thing to feel. Millhaven was a town that ran on information. Not always accurate information, but information nonetheless, and the currency of it was gossip traded over fence lines and across church pews and in the aisles of Harper's General Store, where old Doris Cantwell seemed to have positioned herself permanently beside the flour sacks since approximately 1875. It took until mid-August for the town to notice that Clara Aldridge had been coming regularly to the Bryce Ranch, and approximately 4 additional hours for everyone to have an opinion about it. I heard about those opinions secondhand, as I usually did, because I did not attend the social circles where such things were processed. Thomas heard it from the boys at school. My ranch hand Pete Morales heard it at the saloon. And the Reverend Aldous, who was a good enough man but who sometimes confused his pastoral concern with a general right to involve himself in other people's decisions, heard it from Doris Cantwell directly and felt moved to stop by the ranch on a Tuesday morning. "Callum," he said from atop his gray horse in my yard in the tone that said he was about to be kind at me whether I wanted it or not. "I've been hearing things in town." "I expect you have," I said. I was mending a bridle and I didn't put it down. "About Mrs. Aldridge coming here regularly." He paused. "People are talking. People in Millhaven have talked since before either of us arrived," I said. "I've never found a way to stop them." He shifted in his saddle. "She's a widow woman, Callum. Alone with a child, her reputation matters." I looked up then and I let him see that I was looking. "I haven't done a single thing to harm her reputation, Reverend." "No one is suggesting you have. But appearances, she's been helping me work a difficult horse," I said, "in my round pen in the middle of the day with my son present and her daughter present. If the town finds that scandalous, I believe the fault lies with the town's imagination, not with anything either of us has done." He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. He left shortly after and I went back to the bridle, and I sat with a feeling that wasn't quite anger but was close enough to it to be uncomfortable. Because underneath the irritation was something else. Something that recognized with uncomfortable clarity that the Reverend's visit had made real what I had been carefully not examining, that Clara and I had moved, without either of us naming it, into a territory that Millhaven was correct to notice, even if it was wrong about everything else. The more immediate problem arrived 2 days later in the form of a man named Garrett Hale. Hale was a cattle buyer from Wichita who had been coming through Millhaven for several years. He was perhaps 45, well-dressed by the standards of the cattle trade, with the easy confidence of a man who had money and knew how to make it, and thought those two facts explained most things worth explaining. He had noticed Clara Aldridge. I learned this when Pete mentioned, with the casualness of a man who has learned to deliver uncomfortable information sideways, that Hale had been seen speaking to Clara outside Harper's store on Saturday, and that the conversation had gone on for a considerable time, and that he had tipped his hat to her in a way that suggested he considered the hat tipping to be an investment rather than a courtesy. "That's her business," I said. Pete looked at me the way he sometimes looked at cattle that were headed for a fence they hadn't seen yet. "Sure is," he said. I told myself it didn't concern me. I told myself this with some energy on Saturday and somewhat less energy on Sunday. And by Monday morning I had given up telling myself anything and just let the irritation sit there where I could see it. I saw Clara on Wednesday. She came to work with Raven in the late morning and we had coffee on the porch afterward as had become the habit, and Lily sat on the porch steps reading the school primer she'd brought with her. Clara mentioned Garrett Hale herself without preamble. "There's a man from Wichita who's taken an interest in speaking with me," she said. She said it simply with no particular emphasis, the way she said most things. "So I heard," I said, which was honest if not complete. She looked at me with a directness that I had come to understand was simply how she was, no softening of the edges, no games. "He asked if he could call on me." The coffee cup in my hand weighed more than it should have. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd think on it." She paused. "I haven't thought on it particularly." I didn't say anything. There was a long silence that the wind came through and left again. "Callum," she said. She didn't often use my given name, and when she did it landed differently. "Is there something you want to say to me?" I looked out at the prairie. I thought about Alina and about 11 years and about how the world does not stop because you need it to. And about how Raven had been afraid not because she was mean but because something had hurt her when she was learning what to trust. "Not today," I said. Clara nodded slowly. She didn't push. That was one of the things about her she didn't push. But walking home over the ridge, she would have passed the place where you can see both ranches at once, and I wondered what she saw when she looked at mine. September came in with a week of cool rain that turned the roads to mud and kept everyone close to their own hearths. I found myself with more time than usual to think, which is rarely a gift when a man has something he's been successfully avoiding. I was afraid. There. It was not a complicated thing once I said it plainly to myself, sitting in my own kitchen in the rain, 49 years of hard-won self-knowledge arranged against the simple, unglamorous truth of it. I was afraid, not of Clara, not of what the town would say, though that was an inconvenience I had no taste for. What I was afraid of was the wanting itself. The specific, irreversible danger of wanting something you could lose. I had lost Alina. I had built myself back from that slowly, board by board, the way you rebuild a structure after a fire, not the same as it was, but standing. And now here was this woman who listened without flinching and moved through the world without apology and had taught my impossible horse to stand still. And every morning I woke up thinking about whether she'd come by that day, and I hated it and I was grateful for it in equal measure, and I did not know what to do with either feeling. Thomas found me on the porch one evening after supper. He sat down in the other chair without being invited, which he had started doing sometime around 13 and which I had never objected to. "She's teaching Lily to read better," he said. "I know. Lily told me she's never had a neighbor with books before. Mama's got a shelf full," she said. I looked at him. "Thomas, I'm not saying anything," he said. "I'm just mentioning what I know." He was quiet a moment. "She's good, Papa. She's a good person." "Anybody can see that." He went inside after that, and I sat with the word he'd used, Papa. He used it less as he got older. He'd used it tonight deliberately, and we both knew it. The following week Clara came on a Thursday as usual, and Raven accepted the saddle without argument for the third time in a row. She let Clara mount her, walked calmly around the pen, and when Clara asked her to step up into a slow jog, she did. It was not perfection. It was something better. It was trust, earned carefully and not yet fully given but present and growing. "She's almost ready," Clara said, dismounting with the ease of a woman who had been riding since she could hold a rein. "Almost," I agreed. We stood at the fence looking at the mare, and the silence that came between us had a different quality than usual. Something had changed in the air, or perhaps in me, and I thought Clara felt it too because she didn't reach for her gloves right away. "Garrett Hale came back through town," she said. My jaw tightened. "Did he?" He was more direct this time. She turned her gloves over in her hands. "He's a respectable man, comfortable. He was clear that he could offer Lily and me a settled life in Wichita." "Wichita's a good city," I said, and my voice was perfectly steady, and I hated how steadily it came out. "It is," she said. Another silence. "Clara," I said. She looked at me. "I have been very careful," I said slowly, "not to say certain things to you because I have not had the right to say them and because I wasn't ready to say them honestly. And I understand that is not your problem to manage." She waited, her eyes on mine. "But I would be wrong not to tell you," I said, "that the thought of you packing up that house and moving to Wichita with a man you talked to outside a general store, that thought sits in me like a stone." The wind moved through the grass beyond the fence. Raven shifted, blew softly through her nose. "A stone," Clara said, and there was something in her voice that might have been amusement and might have been something else entirely. "I'm not good at this," I said. "I haven't spoken like this to another person in 11 years, and I'm aware I'm doing it poorly." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You're not doing it as poorly as you think." She picked up her gloves and pulled them on, one at a time, looking down at her hands. "Come for supper Sunday," she said, "both of you. Thomas too." She walked to her horse, mounted, called to Lily, and rode up the ridge road without looking back. I stood at the fence until I couldn't see them anymore. Sunday supper changed something. It changed it not through any single dramatic thing, but through the accumulation of small and ordinary moments that sometimes carry more weight than all the drama a person can manufacture. Clara's kitchen was warm and full of the smell of roasted chicken and bread, and something with cinnamon that turned out to be apple cake. Her bookshelves ran along the entire north wall of the sitting room. There were more books than I owned furniture. Thomas and Lily found each other's company immediately, with the easy naturalness of children who have both spent too much time with adults and recognize a peer when they see one. They ate together and then went to look at her books while Clara and I sat at the kitchen table with coffee and talked until the lamps needed trimming. I don't know that I can tell you what we talked about. Everything and nothing, the things two people talk about when they have stopped performing for each other and started simply being. Her life in Tennessee as a girl, my father's ranch in Missouri and the winter I was 16 that killed half his cattle and none of his spirit, our losses, our children. What we believed about the future out here on this open, demanding land. At one point she showed me a photograph. It was in a small frame she took from the mantel, a man with a serious face and kind eyes seated with Clara standing beside him and a baby Lily in her arms. "George," she said. I looked at it for a long moment. "He looks like a man you could depend on." "He was," she said. Entirely. She took the photograph back and set it on the mantel again, and I understood that it wasn't being put away. It was simply where it lived. "I'm not looking to replace anything," I said quietly. She looked at me with those direct, undecorated eyes. "Neither am I." On the ride home, Thomas was quiet for a long time, watching the stars come out over the Kansas prairie. "She's got a letter on her table," he said finally. I didn't mean to see it, but the address was facing up, from a law office in Missouri. I looked at him. "I just thought you should know," he said. "I don't know what it means." I didn't either. I found out the following Wednesday when Clara came over the ridge, not for horsework but just, she came. She tied her horse at the post and I was at the barn, and she walked over and stood there looking like someone who has made a decision and is not yet entirely sure it was the right one. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Because you've been honest with me and it would be wrong not to be honest with you in return." We sat on the porch steps because that felt like the right place for it, not inside, not at a table, but out where the air could move. She had not told me everything about leaving Missouri. What she had told me was true. George had died and she had waited 2 years before moving on. What she had not told me was why the move had been more necessary than she had made it sound. George had died with debts she hadn't known about. Not from dishonesty, he hadn't been dishonest, but from a business arrangement that had gone badly wrong. And from the pride of a good man who had not wanted to worry his wife with the particulars until he had solved the problem himself. He had died before he could solve it. The law office in Missouri represented the men who held the notes on those debts. They had located her in Kansas. The letter on her table, the one Thomas had seen, was a formal demand for repayment of an amount she did not have and could not raise from what her small operation produced. If she couldn't answer it, she would lose the Aldridge property. "How long?" I asked. "They've given me until November." It was the first week of October. She was not asking me for money. She made that absolutely clear, with the kind of dignified firmness that told me the thought of asking had cost her something just in the forming of it. She was telling me because she was honest, and because she thought I deserved to know what was sitting on the other side of that ridge. "Is that why you're considering Hale?" I asked, and the question came out more directly than I'd planned. She looked at the prairie for a long time before she answered. "I thought about it," she said. "I'd be lying if I said the timing was coincidental. A comfortable life in Wichita solves a problem, and it would be easy to call that a reason and dress it up as something else. But," I said, "but I've never done a dishonest thing in my life, and I don't intend to start by marrying a man I don't love to settle a debt." The word landed between us, love, and she hadn't been talking about me. Or not precisely, but she hadn't been not talking about me either, and we both sat with it in the cool October air, and neither of us pretended we hadn't heard it. "There might be another way," I said. "I'm not taking your money, Callum. I'm not offering my money," I said. Let me think. She looked at me, and for the first time since I'd known her, there was something in her face that was not composed. Something younger and more frightened and more real than the capable, steady woman she showed the world. All right, she said quietly. Think, I thought. I thought about it the rest of that Wednesday and all of Thursday, and by Friday morning I had an answer, and the answer required me to make a decision I had been avoiding for 3 years. I had 4 horses I had been keeping back from the market, 3 solid quarter horses and 1 exceptional blood bay that a breeder in Abilene had offered me a serious price for twice, and that I had declined twice because I liked having the animal. The combined value if I sold now would be enough, but selling the horses was not the real decision. The real decision was what I intended to say when I brought the money to Clara. Because there is a difference between a man who sells horses to help a neighbor and a man who sells horses because he has decided, with the full weight of 50 years behind him, what he wants the rest of his life to look like. I intended to be the second kind. I rode to Pete first and told him to arrange the sale. Pete asked no questions, which was one of his more valuable qualities. Then I rode to Millhaven to call on the Reverend Aldous. He seemed surprised to see me, which was understandable given that my last visit had ended with me contradicting him on his own front steps. I need your advice, I said, not your pastoral concern, your advice. He blinked. All right, if a man intends to ask a woman a serious question, I said carefully, and the woman has a pressing financial difficulty, and the man could address that difficulty at the same time, how does a man do that without the woman thinking the one is payment for the other? Aldous was quiet for a moment. And then he said something that surprised me. He said he does them in the right order. I looked at him. Ask the question first, he said. Whatever her answer is, help her anyway. That way she knows the help is not conditional. It was, I told him, the most useful thing he'd ever said to me. He looked pleased and a little startled simultaneously. I rode to Clara's on Saturday morning. Lily was in the garden. Clara was on the porch with the letter in her hand, reading it again as if the words might have changed. She looked up when she heard Chester on the road. I tied the horse, walked to the porch, and took my hat off. I want to ask you something, I said. And I need you to hear it without thinking about letters from law offices or men from Wichita or anything else practical. Can you do that? She folded the letter slowly and set it on the rail. I can try, she said. I have lived alone for 11 years, I said, not unhappily mostly. I made my peace with it the way a man makes his peace with weather. You don't fight it, you accommodate it, you keep your roof sound. But I have not been at peace with it since July, and I think you know why. She was very still. I am not a young man, I said. I come with a son who is almost grown and a ranch that is always needing something and more stubbornness than is probably good for anyone. I can't offer you comfort without work, and I won't pretend otherwise. Callum, let me finish, I said. Please. She closed her mouth. I would like to court you honestly with your full knowledge and your full choice in the matter, and I would like to do it with the intention of asking you, in time, to marry me. Not to solve your problem, not to solve mine. Because you are the kind of person I want to spend the rest of my life sitting on a porch with. The wind moved through the cottonwoods along her fence line. Lily was watching from the garden with enormous eyes. Clara stood up from the porch chair. She walked to the railing and looked out at the prairie and was silent for a long while, and I waited because I had learned, at least, how to do that. I'm going to tell you something true, she said finally. All right, I have been frightened of you, she said, not of you, of what I feel when I'm near you. I have been frightened of it since about the 3rd week of working with that horse. I know, I said. I've been frightened of it too. She turned and looked at me, and for the first time in our acquaintance I saw her smile without reservation, fully, without anything held back. Yes, she said. I would like that very much. I let out a breath that I thought might have been held since July. Then I told her about the horses and the money. I told her simply and without embellishment, and I told her that the answer would have been the same regardless of what she'd said. And I watched her face work through the complexity of accepting help from a man who was not yet her husband and from a woman's pride that did not yield easily. "It's a loan," she said finally. "It's whatever you need to call it," I said. She thought about it. "A loan," she said again, "that I will repay." "As you like," I said. She never did repay it, and I never brought it up again, and we were both content with that arrangement. The debt in Missouri was settled in October. Clara sent the bank draft herself, written in her own hand. And she told me afterward that the feeling of dropping it in the mail in Millhaven was the closest thing to freedom she had felt in 4 years. Garrett Hale came through town one more time in November. He stopped at the general store, heard from Doris Cantwell, who could barely contain her satisfaction in the telling that Clara Aldridge was being courted by Callum Bryce. He bought his supplies, tipped his hat to no one in particular, and rode on toward Wichita. I bore him no ill will. He was a man who had seen something worth seeing, and I couldn't fault his judgment. Raven was fully saddle-broken by November. Clara put her through her paces in the round pen one last morning, walked her out through the gate and across the open pasture behind the barn, and let her move at a full run along the fence line, the mare's black mane flying, her stride opening up like she had always known how and had simply been waiting for the right moment to show it. Clara brought her back blowing and bright-eyed, and she was laughing when she dismounted, actually laughing, with her hair coming loose from its pins and her eyes reflecting the October sky. "I cannot tell you I have ever seen anything more beautiful in 50 years on this earth. I will not try to." I courted Clara Aldridge through the fall and into the winter of 1883. We were not the gossip of Millhaven so much as we were its quiet satisfaction. Even Doris Cantwell, who could find the flaw in a sunrise, seemed to approve, or at least to offer no objection, which in her case amounted to the same thing. I asked Clara to marry me on a Sunday in December on the porch of my ranch house, with the first real snow of the season coming down slow and soft across the Kansas prairie. Thomas was inside, conspicuously not watching from the window. Lily was there, she had asked to be, with the directness of a child who knows what she wants, and Clara had said yes, let her be there. I did not have a speech prepared. I had a ring that had been my grandmother's, plain silver, worn smooth on the inside where she had worn it for 40 years. "I know you loved George," I said. "I know you'll always love him. I'm not asking you to stop. I'm only asking if there's room." Clara looked at the ring in my hand for a long moment. Then she held out her hand, and when I put it on her finger, she looked at it in the snow light and said, "There has always been room, Callum. I was just afraid to let anyone know it." We were married in February of 1884 in the Millhaven Church by the Reverend Aldous, who delivered a sermon that was actually quite good and managed not to take any credit for any of it, which I thought showed real growth on his part. Thomas walked Clara down the aisle because she asked him to, and because her own father had died years before and she wanted the arm of a person she trusted. He was 15 by then, nearly as tall as I was, with his mother's patience and apparently an emerging talent for the kind of quiet grace that would have made a leaner proud. He offered Clara his arm with a solemnity that made half the church reach for their handkerchiefs. Lily held my hand during the ceremony. I had not expected her to. She simply slipped her small hand into mine as we waited at the front of the church, and I held it like it was made of something precious, because it was. Clara's photograph of George stayed on the mantel at her house, our house, after she moved in that spring. I never asked her to put it away. I never wanted to. He was part of how she became who she was, and who she was everything. We worked the ranches together through the spring and into the summer, running the Aldridge land as pasture for my cattle and eventually combining the operations the way two rivers combine when the terrain allows it, naturally, without forcing. Raven foaled in the spring of 1885. A black colt with his mother's blaze and a temperament that was curious rather than afraid, the kind of animal that comes to the fence to look at you rather than running from the sound of your boots. Clara named him Trust. I thought that was exactly right. People in Millhaven sometimes told the story of how Callum Bryce tamed his wild horse and how in the taming of her found himself a wife. It made for a good story at church socials and around winter fires, and it was true enough in the broad outlines. But the truth inside the truth was this: I had not asked Clara Aldridge for help because I was weak. I had asked her because I was finally, after 50 years of being certain I could manage everything alone. Honest enough to admit that there are things in this world that a man cannot do by himself, not for lack of skill or strength or patience, but because some things simply require two people. Raven was afraid because something had hurt her when she was still learning what to trust. I was not so different. Grief had gotten to me when I was young enough that it shaped how I stood in the world for years afterward, careful, self-sufficient, glad for the company of cattle and horses and a good son. But armored against the kind of wanting that can leave a person undone. Clara had not broken through that armor. She had simply sat beside it, patient and honest and present, until I remembered it was something I had built and not something I had been born with. That is what good people do. They don't rescue you, they remind you that you were never as lost as you decided to believe. There is no small thing about asking for help. In this country, in those years, a man who couldn't carry his own weight was a man who wasn't long for the frontier. I understand that pride, I lived it. But I also know what I would have missed if I had ridden back down that ridge road without knocking on Clara's gate, the years, the mornings. The sound of her voice on the porch in the last of the daylight, Lily grown and Thomas gone to his medicine and coming home at Christmas with his serious eyes and his mother's patience. And Raven's colt in the pasture, curious instead of afraid. I asked my neighbor to tame my horse. What she tamed in the gentlest possible way was the part of me that had forgotten how to let someone in. If that's not worth asking for help, I don't know what is. Thank you for riding along with us tonight, friends. Stories like this one remind us that the bravest thing a person can do is not always the loudest thing. Sometimes it is simply showing up at a neighbor's gate with your hat in your hand and the honest truth of what you need. We are grateful for every one of you who finds a seat beside this fire week after week. If this story moved you, tell someone who might need it. Leave a word in the comments. We read every one. And if you are new here, welcome to Rusted Saddle Stories. We keep the fire going. Until next time, keep writing.